She wasn't just protecting her child, she was defending a future where no one would have to endure what she had. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Westfield, Alabama, the kind of day where the heat hung thick in the air, heavy like a blanket. Amara Williams, a 30-year-old woman who was 6 months pregnant, had just finished her shift at the local diner. Her feet ached from standing all day, but her mind was focused on one thing: getting home. The grocery store was just a few blocks away, and she had decided to pick up a few things for dinner. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of passing cars and the distant sounds of children playing. With her bag of groceries in hand, Amara walked slowly, her other hand gently resting on her swollen belly. She was taking her time, savoring the moment of peace, the humdrum of daily life that made her feel safe. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and asphalt, the combination that reminded her of summers spent in her childhood neighborhood. She had grown up in Westfield, and though the town wasn't known for being diverse, it was home. As she made her way down the cracked sidewalks, she noticed the rumble of an approaching police car behind her. It wasn't unusual to see the police cruising through the area, but today, for some reason, the car felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The car slowed as it neared her. Amara glanced over her shoulder, and her stomach tightened when she saw Officer Jared Thompson behind the wheel. Officer Thompson had been in the department for years, but his name was one that stirred discomfort in the hearts of many in the black community. His reputation wasn't one of kindness or justice. No, he was known for his aggressive behavior, especially toward people like Amara. She had heard the stories, witnessed the disdain he held for people of color, and felt the weight of his presence even now. The car came to a halt beside her, and Officer Thompson stepped out. His tall frame towered over her, his expression hard and uninviting. Amara felt the familiar knot form in her chest, but she kept her head down and tried to maintain her composure. "Hey, you," Thompson barked. His voice was harsh, unreasoning. "What are you doing out here, walking around like you own the place?" Amara's heart skipped. She had done nothing wrong. She was just walking home, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She had been through enough encounters with the police to know that any word or action could be twisted against her. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. "I'm just walking home," she replied quietly, forcing her voice to remain calm. Thompson sneered, his eyes scanning her as if she were a problem to be dealt with. "Well, people like you shouldn't be walking around here, especially not at this hour." Before she could respond, he took a step closer, his heavy boots thudding against the ground. He shoved her with a force that caught her off guard, pushing her shoulder so hard she lost her balance. Instinctively, Amara reached for her stomach, trying to protect her unborn child, but before she could regain her footing, Thompson kicked her in the back, sending her sprawling onto the hot pavement. The sudden impact made everything blur. Pain shot through her body like an electric current. Her breath left her in a rush, and her hand went instinctively to her belly, fearing the worst. She struggled to push herself up, the heat of the asphalt burning through her clothes. Her heart raced, her mind frantically trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Amara's voice trembled with anger and fear, but Thompson didn't flinch. "Get up and get moving," he spat, his face a mask of cold disdain. "People like you don't belong here." Every inch of her body screamed with pain, but it was the insult that burned deeper, the racism, the disregard for her life, her humanity. Amara looked up at him, eyes blazing, but she knew better than to fight back. Not now, not in this moment. But something in her had shifted. As she slowly pushed herself to her feet, her body aching, Amara made a promise to herself and to her child. This wouldn't be the end. She would fight. Amara struggled to stand, her body trembling with pain, her legs weak beneath her as she fought to maintain her balance. The heat from the asphalt seemed to cling to her skin, making the situation feel even more suffocating. She took a deep breath, her hand still pressed against her swollen belly, trying to calm herself and her baby. The world around her seemed to fade for a moment, the only sound the rapid thudding of her heartbeat in her ears. "Get up and get moving," Officer Thompson's voice rang out again, cold and dismissive. "Don't make me tell you again." Amara was so stunned by what had just happened, by the violent push and the cruel kick, that she almost didn't register the footsteps approaching her. But then a strong hand gripped her arm, pulling her gently to her feet. "Are you okay?" The voice belonged to Malcolm Harris, a neighbor from a few doors down. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had seen more than his fair share of injustice in the small town. Malcolm had been watching from his porch when he saw everything unfold. Amara winced as she stood, her back and stomach aching with every movement. "I think so. Just—" Her voice broke as the weight of what had happened settled on her chest. She looked back at Officer Thompson, who stood with his arms crossed, watching her with a sense of superiority, as though nothing had happened. He didn't seem to care one bit. "You need to get checked out," Malcolm said, his voice laced with anger, but he kept his tone steady. "Let me call an ambulance. You don't look good." Before Amara could protest, he pulled out his phone, dialing for help. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but so did a crowd of onlookers. Word spread fast in a small town. The police cruiser had been parked right on the corner, and a few people had witnessed the exchange. As the paramedics checked her over, Amara felt a strange mixture of emotions: embarrassment, anger, fear, but mostly she felt a sense of disbelief. Was this really happening? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. She had never imagined something like this could happen to her. She had lived in Westfield her whole life, walked the same streets day after day, and yet, in an instant, everything had changed. Malcolm stayed by her side, never leaving her alone, and as the crowd began to gather, Amara could hear whispers, murmurs, and the rising anger from those who had witnessed it all. Some of the older folks, the ones who had lived in Westfield for decades, muttered that they'd always known Thompson had a problem with people like her. Others stood in disbelief, unsure of what to make of what they had just seen. Someone started recording. It was a man from the building across the street, his phone raised, capturing the incident from every angle. As the camera rolled, Amara's heart dropped. She knew this footage was going to spread fast. There would be no denying what had just happened. No way to ignore the brutal reality of what Thompson had done. By the time the ambulance took her to the hospital, the video had already been shared on social media. Hashtags began to surface. Justice for Amara. The phone calls started coming in from people in town, from activists, from strangers. But even as the world began to rally behind her, Amara couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. She had been wronged in the most intimate way, and now her pain was being laid bare for the world to see. At that moment, though, as she sat in the sterile hospital room, her phone buzzing with messages of support, something inside her shifted. It was no longer just about her. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, the ones whose stories had never been heard. She wasn't just a victim. She was a voice that would not be silenced. Amara's recovery was slow. The bruises on her back and stomach faded, but the emotional wounds lingered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Officer Thompson's face, the sneer on his lips as he kicked her to the ground. The physical pain had been intense, but it was the crushing weight of his cruelty, the casual violence he had inflicted, that hurt the most. She could barely look at herself in the mirror without seeing his boot on her body. Her days were filled with the constant hum of interviews, phone calls, and protest organizers asking for her support. People wanted her to become the face of a movement, but Amara didn't feel like a symbol. She just wanted to be a mother, to raise her daughter in a world where she wouldn't have to face the same kind of hatred that Amara had endured. At night, she would sit in her apartment, cradling her belly as she stared out the window. The streets of Westfield, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a battlefield. Everywhere she went, people recognized her, some with sympathy, others with anger in their eyes. Malcolm, her neighbor, had been a constant source of support. He visited her almost every day, offering comfort and reassurance. He had become a brother to her during the ordeal. He reminded her to take care of herself and not let the weight of the movement drag her down. "You're doing something bigger than yourself, Amara," Malcolm would say when she got discouraged. "This isn't just about you, and it's not about revenge. It's about making sure your daughter doesn't grow up in a world where she has to fear the people who are supposed to protect her." Still, there were moments when Amara wanted to walk away from it all. The pressure was suffocating, and the legal process felt like a never-ending cycle of bureaucracy. Thompson remained on paid administrative leave while the investigation dragged on. It felt like justice was slipping further and further away, just out of reach. But every time she thought about quitting, Amara remembered her daughter, the life she was carrying, and the future she wanted to create. This fight was not just for her, it was for all the black lives that had been crushed under the weight of systemic injustice. She couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The days that followed the incident felt like an endless blur for Amara. Her body healed slowly, but her mind was still gripped by the trauma of what had happened. It was a relentless cycle of interviews, protests, and legal proceedings. People rallied around her, calling for justice. The hashtag number Justice for Amara went viral, flooding social media platforms, and soon the town of Westfield found itself at the heart of a much larger conversation. But despite the swelling public outcry, the system that was supposed to protect her was still dragging its feet. Officer Jared Thompson had been placed on administrative leave, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Amara had always known that the fight for justice wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated the emotional and psychological toll it would take. The legal battle began, and with it came a sense of urgency, but also a growing sense of uncertainty. Despite the overwhelming evidence, witness testimony, video footage, and the clear brutality of Thompson's actions, Amara knew the process would be slow and the outcome uncertain. The justice system wasn't designed to protect people like her. The trial began several months later, after a series of delays that only made the weight of her anger and frustration heavier. Thompson's defense team tried to twist the narrative. They painted him as a man simply doing his job, claiming that he had feared for his safety during the encounter. They tried to make Amara's words and actions seem aggressive, suggesting that she had provoked the officer in some way. They even went so far as to imply that her pregnancy was irrelevant to the situation, as if the life growing inside her didn't matter. But Amara wasn't having it. She had already made the decision that she would speak up, speak for herself, for her unborn child, and for all the others who had been mistreated or silenced by an unjust system. When it was her turn to testify, she walked into the courtroom with her head held high, her chest full of defiance, her mind focused on one thing: truth. "I wasn't the threat," Amara said, her voice steady and unwavering as she looked directly at the jury. "I was just walking home. I didn't provoke him. I didn't ask for this. I was just a pregnant woman trying to make it through the day, and this man, this officer, attacked me for no reason other than the color of my skin." The courtroom was silent as she spoke, her words hanging in the air like an indictment of everything that was wrong with a system that allowed this kind of abuse to happen without consequence. Amara's testimony was powerful, raw, and unflinching. She didn't hold back. She didn't flinch when Thompson's attorney tried to discredit her. She didn't shrink when the defense questioned her integrity. She was there for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or crushed under the weight of racism and police brutality. The trial lasted for weeks, and the tension in the air was palpable. Each day, more people came to show their support for Amara. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, chanting her name, demanding justice not just for her, but for all victims of police violence. Inside the courtroom, it was clear that the case had become bigger than just one woman's fight. It was about a movement, a collective call for accountability, for change. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury deliberated and delivered their verdict. Guilty. Officer Jared Thompson was convicted of assault and misconduct. He was fired from the police force, and criminal charges were brought against him. It wasn't the sweeping victory Amara had dreamed of. There was still much work to be done, and the road to real justice was far from over. But in that moment, in the courtroom as the verdict was read, Amara felt a small flicker of hope. This was a step forward, a step toward accountability, toward the possibility of real change. Her fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in months, Amara allowed herself a breath. It was a victory, and though it was small, it was hers. Months after the trial, Amara's life had changed in ways she never expected. The victory in court, though significant, hadn't marked the end of her journey. It had only ignited a new beginning. Officer Jared Thompson was convicted and fired, but Amara knew that real change would require more than a single victory. It would require a movement, a collective force to challenge the systems that allowed injustice to thrive. She had given birth to her daughter, Justice, a symbol of hope and resilience. Every time she cradled her newborn in her arms, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Justice wasn't just a name, it was a promise that her daughter would grow up in a world where the color of her skin wouldn't determine her safety, her worth, or her place in society. Amara's voice became louder in the fight for police reform and racial justice. She worked with grassroots organizations, speaking at rallies, attending protests, and using her story to bring attention to the urgent need for systemic change. She shared her experience in interviews, not as a victim, but as a survivor, determined to ensure no one else would have to endure what she had. Her story resonated with countless others. Black voices, often silenced by the very institutions that were meant to protect them, found strength in Amara's courage. She became a beacon of hope, proof that even in the darkest of moments, strength could rise from pain. She had endured a brutal assault, but through it, she had found her power, her purpose, and a voice that could no longer be ignored. The movement grew. Amara's story spread across the country, bringing attention to the widespread issue of police violence against Black people. People took to the streets, demanding justice not just for her, but for all who had been harmed by systemic racism. Her fight became a catalyst for change, one that reached far beyond Westfield, Alabama. Amara didn't just rise from the ashes of her own pain, she became a force of nature. With every march, every speech, and every call for justice, she proved that even one voice, no matter how small it seemed, could spark a revolution. The fight wasn't over, but Amara knew, deep in her heart, that it was a fight worth having. Thank you for joining Amara's journey. Her fight is far from over, but with every voice, we move closer to justice. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories of resilience and hope.